Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for coming. And tonight's share is sponsored Li'aliyat Neshama of Binyamin Yisrael ben Shlomo Halevi, as well as Sevilla Bas David, and a refuah shlema for Baruch ben Golda and Baruch Yaakov ben Kevana, as well as the Chaim Yehoshua ben Hendel and the Tinaik, who's not yet named, ben Itra Hina, and Stephen ben Chava and Breya bat Chava. They should have a refuah shlema b'toch shar Cholei Yisrael.
You're not mentioning the judge who was nifter?
Which judge was nifter?
Never mind.
Oh, okay, tell me. Yeah, and this week's shir is sponsored by a friend of mine from New York, Alan Fine, who happens to be in Eretz Yisrael. He wanted to come tonight, but I guess he couldn't. In honor of the shir for all the inspiration on Torah that the Rav has infused in me, and by Arek Davinsky, dedicated to Ilana and Simcha Davinsky, their birthdays, which are on the 25th and the 30th of Shvat, respectively. Wish them all both of them a happy birthday. Okay, thank you. I don't know if you want to tell me about the judge. Which judge was nifter?
It was on the news.
I didn't see it yet. So.
I know that there was a lot of traffic this afternoon because of her Levaya.
This is an Israeli judge?
Yeah.
Former Supreme Court head.
What was his name?
It's a woman.
Okay, well, again, she should also have an aliyat neshama. We hope that Hashem should have rachamim on all of the Jews. Okay, we are. I don't. Until I know the person, I can't say anything more than that. But everything should be good. So we are now in Parshat Mishpatim. And for those of you that have legal training, Mishpatim, of course, is very, very, very fascinating because it is really the civil law structure of the Torah. It is the mitzvot bein adam lechaveiro, all of the rules of damages, all of the rules of shomrim, of bailments are in Parshas Mishpatim. And indeed, Parshas Mishpatim is the foundation for two whole Masechtas in Shas, Maseches Bava Kama and Maseches Bava Metzia. Bava Basra is also a civil law tractate, but that is derived from other psukim. But Bava Metzia, Bava Kama are solidly rooted in Parshat Mishpatim. In fact, I recall a hearing from Rav Yehuda Cooperman, Chronological, who was the founder of Michlala, which is a very, very well-known women's seminary, and he himself was a great, great Talmid Chacham in many, many meforshim of Chumash. He wrote very excellent books. He once said, a Jew that knows Parshat Mishpatim with Rashi very well cannot be called an Am Haaretz. He is by definition an educated Jew because he knows the basic halachic structures of Choshen Mishpat. Now, the one thing I do want to clarify something before I get into the main thing I want to talk about. I want to clarify something that sometimes gets people a little mixed up. And that is, on one hand, Judaism seems to make the claim, as Pirkei Avos says, Moshe kibel Torah mi Sinai. Moshe got the Torah at Mount Sinai. Now, it's one thing to say the Torah comes from God. That's fundamental. But this statement makes an additional claim. Not only did God give Moshe the Torah, but God gave Moshe the Torah in a specific place at Mount Sinai. So I think I may have touched upon this, but I just want to clarify it because it comes up here a lot. What does it mean that that God gave Moshe the Torah at Mount Sinai? Now there's a very simple problem here. What does Torah mean? I mean, after all, the story of Matan Torah is in the middle of the Chumash. There's a lot of things that happen after the events of Matan Torah. In fact, most of the history of the Jewish people as recorded in the Torah is after Sinai. The Sinai revelation occurred in the first year, and the Torah ends in the 40th year. So in what sense could it be said that Moshe got the Torah on Mount Sinai. What did he get? So point number one is that the word Torah does not mean the Sefer Torah, and it does not mean the 5 books of Moses. The story of Korach, the story of the Meraglim, the story of Moshe hitting the rock, that was not given to Moshe b'Sinai. If that would be the case, you'd kind of have an absurdity that everybody in the Torah that does something after this event is simply reading from a script. Like Moshe is a director, Moshe gives the pages to Korach and say, you stand where that line is, and in around 5 minutes, the ground's going to open up, and the show must go on. I mean, obviously, when Korach did what he did, when the Jewish people built the Egel, for that matter, there was no pre-existing revelation that said that they would do it. In fact, the Gemara itself says this. The Gemara itself says there's a machlokes. Either these narratives were written after they happened, meaning after the Cheder Egel, Moshe was told, write these words about the Egel. After Korach, write these words about Korach. Right after Meraglim, write about the Meraglim. Based on that, the Torah was actually written over a 40-year period. And therefore there was no mitzias of a Sefer Torah till the last day of Moshe Rabbeinu's life. And there's even a machlokes in the Gemara who wrote the last 8 verses of the Torah. They talk about Moshe dying. Some say Moshe wrote them. Some say Yehoshua wrote them, interestingly enough. But that's very important. Moshe did not come down from Mount Sinai with a Sefer Torah. There's a machlokes in the Gemara. Was the Torah written as it happened, right after it happened, or was nothing written until the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life? That's a machlokes in Maseches Gittin. Torah chasuma nitna. So in that context, Torah means Sefer Torah, which is different than Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai. This is a very important key to understanding Chazal. Chazal do not always use the same term in the same way. The machlokes in Gittin, if Torah was given at one time or was given over time, means Sefer Torah. How was the Sefer Torah written? Was the Sefer Torah written at the very end, from Bereshis to the end? Or was the Sefer Torah written incrementally as events happened? That's Torah chasuma nitna, one piece. Megillah nitna, it was given partially. So there, the word Torah means the Sefer Torah, the nusach of the Sefer Torah. Now, when we go back to Pirkei Avos, and we say, Moshe kibel Torah miSinai, Moshe received the Torah at Sinai, it doesn't mean the Sefer Torah, because that's the machlokes, Torah Megillah nitna, or Torah chasuma nitna, but rather Torah would mean, at most, the 613 mitzvos, with the supplementary explanations that we call Torah Shebal Peh. Okay, so we have to redefine Torah. Torah doesn't mean Sefer Torah, it means mitzvahs. But even then, even with that redefinition, you got a problem. Because, let's say, for example, in Parshas Yisro, we read about the Aseret HaDibros. And after the Aseret HaDibros, Hashem gives Moshe commandments about a Mizbeach, how to build a Mizbeach, that it should be out of stone, and it shouldn't be cut with metal. And then we are given all the civil laws, all of the Mishpatim. And then Moshe goes up to Har Sinai for 40 days, and then we are given commandments of Mishkan. The problem basically is this. It's clear from the nusach of the Chumash itself that mitzvos were given over a prolonged period of time. Not just narratives happening, but Yedaber Hashem el Moshe Lemor, right? There are mitzvos in Sefer Vayikra, there are mitzvos in Sefer Bamidbar, there are mitzvos in Sefer Devarim that were not repeated before, not mentioned before. So how do you reconcile that with the idea of Moshe got all the mitzvahs? So the Chazon Ish gives us a very, very useful Hagdara. Again, it may not fit every statement of Maimer Chazal, but B'derech Klal, this is a very, very, not that the Chazon Ish needs my haskama, but a very sensible pshat that you can hold on to. And he says, we have to differentiate between the private revelations to Moshe and when Moshe communicated that to Bnei Yisrael. In the 40 days that Moshe was at Mount Sinai, or in the mountain, covered by the cloud, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Moshe all of the mitzvos. That the Taryag mitzvos, including their interpretations, including whatever is included in the oral law. That itself is an interesting topic. That doesn't mean he gave Moshe word for word Mishnah and Gemara. Sometimes, I know in our Sameach, we try to, I don't do that part of the curriculum, so to speak, but we want to convince the Talmidim that Torah Shebaal Peh comes from Sinai, so a lot of guys walk around with the idea every word in the Gemara was given to Moshe and transmitted for, again, that's a pious notion, that's a religious notion. I don't want to be mezalzel, someone that has that view, but it's kind of a ridiculous view. Obviously, when Abaye asks, Abaye and Rav are debating, they are not reading from a script either. So when we say the oral law, the Torah Shebaal Peh, we mean the principles of Torah Shebaal Peh. The working out of the applications are done by human beings who are gazillions of times greater than us, but it's the same process. What you do in the Beis HaMedrash is no different than what Abaye and Rava did in the Beis HaMedrash, other than the fact that they're, billions of times greater than us. But it's the same process. When you're thinking about a svara, you're not like waiting to hear, what did Hashem tell Moshe again? And, you're not doing that. You're using your mind. They use their mind. Okay, that's a general issue of Torah Shebaal Peh. But whatever it was, Moshe got that stuff, but he was not yet authorized to reveal it to Bnei Yisrael until there were various occasions. So you have to be machalek between when did Moshe get the mitzvos and when was he given permission and authorization to reveal the mitzvos to Am Yisrael. Now, if you ask me why certain mitzvahs are not revealed until there's a Mishkan, and indeed in the book of Devarim, like Yibum, certain mitzvahs are not revealed until the 40th year in the desert, I don't know. You have to look at every single mitzvah. But the point that I'm making is that the giving of the Torah to Am Yisrael was a 40-year process. Okay? Even if Moshe got all of those mitzvahs b'Sinai. Now with this, the Chazon Ish is masbir in a very interesting way. Again, it doesn't fit all the midrashim, but it fits many things. The concept of the 4 areas where Moshe Rabbeinu did not know the halacha, and he had to ask Hashem, and that was after Matan Torah. That was after Matan Torah, after the 40 days, after the second Luchos even. Right? So let's go in order. The first was the issue of the Makoshesh. The first was the Megadef, the one who blasphemed, the one who cursed Hashem. So Moshe Rabbeinu did not know what the punishment is for blasphemy. He had to ask Hashem, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu said the punishment is skila. Now, if Moshe got the Torah b'Sinai, what didn't he know? Similarly, by the Makoshesh. Makoshesh is the one that gathered wood on Shabbos. Machlek is what the malacha was, but let's assume it was just carrying. He was picking up sticks and carrying 4 amos in a Rishus Harabim. So Moshe Rabbeinu knew Hashem had already said, Mechalaleha mos yumas, that somebody who's Mechalal Shabbos is Chayiv Misa. Moshe knew that, but Moshe didn't know which Misa you get from Mechalal Shabbos. He had to ask Hashem, and Hashem said, Skila. Well, wait a second. If Moshe got the whole Torah Misinai, then l'chari he was told that the Einish would be Skila. Wasn't he told that, right? The third example is Pesach Sheni. When they brought their first Korban Pesach, this was 10 months after Matan Torah, a year after, a year minus 2 weeks after Yetzias Mitzrayim. No, a year after Yetzias Mitzrayim, Korban Pesach. So there were people who were tamei, and they thought they could not bring the Korban Pesach, and they said to Moshe, why should we be deprived of bringing the Korban Pesach? And Moshe says, gee, you got a point, I don't know. He asks Hashem, and Hashem tells him, if somebody is tamei, they are given the opportunity to bring the Korban Pesach a month later, and that is called Pesach Sheni. And the fourth is the daughters of Tzlavchad, right? Tzlavchad died in the Midbar. Tzlavchad did not have any sons. The halacha of Yerusha said that sons inherit, and if there are no sons, so the brothers of Tzlavchad claim that they should inherit rather than the girls. And the girls say, hey, not fair, not right. And Moshe asks Hashem, and Hashem says that daughters have the right to inherit when there are no sons, and they have priority over the brothers of the deceased. Right, 4 cases. The Megadef, the blasphemer, the Mekaishesh, the gatherer of wood, Pesach Sheni, and B'nai Tzlavchad. In all of these cases, Moshe Rabbeinu did not know the halacha, and he had to ask Hashem. So the question is, what does that mean? Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai. The whole Torah. And Rashi makes the point, Kololosayim Upratosayim. The klal and the prat, all the details. It wasn't just given in a general way. So the chashan is, so there are midrashim that say, there are taka midrashim that say that at least for some of them, Moshe Rabbeinu was angry, Moshe Rabbeinu was upset, and there's taka and inyan, that kas, anger, can make you forget Torah. So there are indeed midrashim that talk about this as a shichacha. But the Chazon Ish says, al pi pshat, we could say that Moshe Rabbeinu has a genuine dilemma. Moshe Rabbeinu has inside information that he was not yet given permission to reveal. Moshe Rabbeinu knows that Mechalel Shabbos is Beskila, but the only thing he told Am Yisrael was Mechaleleha Mos Yumas. That pasuk was communicated, right? The rest wasn't. So the Chazon Ish says, it's not that Moshe doesn't know the halacha, but Moshe does not know if he is authorized to implement a halacha that he knows is the halacha, but he was not yet given the rishus to be megala. He has to ask Hashem, and Hashem says, now is the occasion to be megala the halacha. See, that's very interesting. So basically it was a question of when is Moshe authorized, and that is the meaning of the ubiquitous phrase, Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, which in English is just translated, and the Lord said to Moshe, saying. So it's always extra, saying. You know, what are you saying? But the Chazon Ish says, no, lemor is to tell other people. Hashem says to Moshe, lemor, to tell this, meaning you knew this before. You knew this before. Now I'm giving you rishus. So now it's a whole mitzvah. You can write a book in this. So why are certain mitzvahs revealed at certain times? I don't know if you can give a global answer to that. You have to look at each particular mitzvah. But that's an important point of understanding that Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai, number 1, does not refer to Sefer Torah. It only refers to mitzvahs. And number 2, when Moshe received the mitzvahs, is not the same as when we received the mitzvahs. Which means, in other words, this highlights the unique importance of a parsha like Mishpatim. Because it turns out that even though Moshe Rabbeinu may have gotten Gittin and Yibum and many, many halachas at Sinai, but there were comparatively few that he was told to reveal to us right now. And indeed, Parshas Mishpatim is not only Niskala from Moshe going up to Har Sinai, it was revealed to Moshe to tell us before he went up to Har Sinai. Right after the Aseret HaDibros. See, again, we sometimes get thrown off because we have 2 parshas. We finished the parsha of the Aseret HaDibros, now we have a new parsha. But you got to read it straight. If you read it straight, the Aseret HaDibros are immediately followed by, building a Mizbeach, some other halachas, and then Mishpatim. So when did we hear them? We heard them, from Moshe, before Moshe even went up to Har Sinai. So that's an important musar in and of itself, because Parshas Mishpatim is largely the mitzvos bein Adam lechavero, between man and man, And we know that sometimes people think being a religious Jew is primarily about davening, about kashrus, about Shabbos, about talis, about tzitzis, about tefillin. Honesty in business, maybe that's a little negotiable, so to speak. And yet we see that the Torah B'davka puts a primacy on these inyanim of Mishpatim, even ahead of many, many other inyanim that we might consider on some level more important. And that's an important insight. The Mabit was a contemporary of Rav Yosef Karo, the Beis Yosef. Rav Yosef Karo was the Rav of Tzfat in the 1500s, and Moshe ben Yosef Trani was the Av Beis of Tzfat. They had a huge machlokes about Shemitah, by the way, which has repercussions in the controversial Heter Mechira, that the Beis Yosef Shita was that peiros that grew on non-Jewish property didn't have the holiness of Shemitah, and therefore you're allowed to buy them and eat them, but you have to take off Trumas and Maasros. The Mabit, on the other hand, Paskin, they have Kedusha Shvius, so all the Shemitah restrictions apply, but that would also mean you don't have to take off Trumas and Maasros. And Yosef Karo was not happy about the Mabit paskening this way, and at some point he actually was going to put the Mabit in Cherem for allowing people to buy Peiros Shel Nochri without taking off Trumas and Maasros. But you can understand that the whole Machlekes Beis Yosef and the Mabit, if the holiness of Shemitah applies to the produce of Goyim, is very, very relevant on the whole inyan of whether you could get out of Shemitah by selling land to Goyim. So that's really a big, big Machlokes. I don't want to get into that now. But the Mabit, in addition to being one of the Gedolei HaPoskim, the Mabit was also a Jewish philosopher, and the Mabit wrote a sefer that's still worthwhile to learn. It's called Beis Elokim, which talks about Yesodos of Emunah. And the Mabit actually says the following interesting point. We generally look at the Luchos, and the Luchos, by the way, even our picture is not common. First of all, the Luchos were not rounded on the top. The Luchos were even, squared. And number two, they were not connected. They were two different Luchos. In other words, Moshe's holding two square, rectangular blocks. Right? So they weren't even mechubar. But be it as it may, the general understanding is that the first 5 dibros are Bein Adam Lamakom, man and God, and the second 5 are Bein Adam Lechavero, interpersonal. Even that, interesting question. The first 4 clearly are Bein Adam Lamakom, belief in Hashem, not believing in other gods, not taking Hashem's name in vain, keeping Shabbos, those are 4. The 5th one is Kibbud Aviyim. Some would argue Kibbud Aviyim is an interpersonal mitzvah. Why is it on the first column? Because you'd have 4 and 6, but whatever it would be, that wouldn't be the reason. So again, there's a lot you can say on that. Part of it is that when I have gratitude towards the human beings who gave me life, that leads me to have gratitude to Hashem for the source of all life. Meaning one who cannot honor his parents does not have hakaras hatov for chayim. And if I don't have hakaras hatov for my life, I will not be able to connect to God. There is also a deeper psychological reason why Kibbud Aviyim is treated as Bein Adam Lamakom, and that is a child's understanding of God will be based in large part on how they relate to a parent. You know, a child comes into the world, a baby comes into the world in a very, very vulnerable state, a state of total dependency. And a parent is a godlike figure, almighty, all-powerful, right? I remember that time of, where a child thinks a father could do anything, like Superman, whatever it would be. I mean, that passes, but still, there is this idea. So here is the question: How does a child think of Hashem? A child thinks of Hashem the way they think of Daddy and Mommy, Abba and Ima. So if Abba and Ima are loving, supportive, compassionate, stable, always there for you, so a person looks at Hashem. That's what Hashem is. But what if this all-powerful parent is unpredictable? Different moods. You never know how the person's going to behave. Arbitrary. Even if not abusive, but could also be abusive even. then that's going to be the image the child forms of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, are we locked into our childish images? Not necessarily. A person can grow up, but you'd be surprised. Maybe you won't be surprised how difficult it is to grow up. As a person could be a person of phenomenal accomplishment in life, and they're still laboring under impressions and under feelings that they absorbed as a young child. Those things don't go away, no matter how great, no matter how eminent you are. They can still be in there. I remember seeing an interview with Richard Nixon. Because some of us look back and we look at Nixon with some fondness in terms of Israel and everything else. But Nixon had a controversial life, and he had resigned the presidency. And for a few years he remained incognito, but then he began to try to rehabilitate himself, and by the end of his life, actually, he had kind of built up a somewhat of a good reputation in many, many circles, and presidents consulted him on foreign policy issues and the like. So he was being interviewed by somebody. It was not David Frost, it was somebody else. And here was a man, who had resigned the presidency. I mean, you consider that like the biggest negative thing you could possibly do. And he was talking about the pain that he experienced from 6th grade playground taunts. He says, it never gets away from you. I mean, gee, is that what he's thinking about? Yeah, apparently that is what he's thinking about. And that's kind of scary, because those types of things, right? So you think, when you push somebody in a playground, you don't know that, maybe 30 years, 40 years later will be president of the United States, and world decisions are going to be made because you pushed him or you abused him. So the point I'm just making is that because parents are kind of like God, the way a parent relates to a child is how a child forms his image of Hashem. Okay, but be it as it may, putting that aside, that was really a side point. The first 5 mitzvos are bein Adam lamakom, man and God. The second 5 mitzvos are bein Adam l'chaver. Now here's what the Mabit says. You'll notice that the number of words on the first 5 are much more than the number of words on the second 5. The second 5 are very staccato. Lo tirtzach, lo tinaf, right? So, if we assume that the words, the letters that were engraved covered the same amount of space, then if one side has more words and one side has less words, but they cover the same surface area, it has to be that the engraving on the second was much larger than the engraving on the first. You see that graphically, because if I have fewer words that have to cover the same space, the letters have to be bigger. So now, let's imagine Moshe Rabbeinu is coming down. Okay, the first luchos were smashed. We never saw those first luchos. But let's say it's Yom Kippur. Moshe Rabbeinu is coming down with the second luchos. And I put on my glasses to peer. What's he bringing down there? What commandments, this is the Mabit, what commandments am I going to see first? When Moshe Rabbeinu is bringing down the luchos, the Mabit says, I'm going to see the second 5. I'm going to be able to make out the second 5 before I make out the first 5. I'm going to see the bein Adam l'chaveiro before I see the bein Adam lamakom. And this is how important mitzvahs bein Adam l'chaveiroi are. Indeed, we know that mitzvahs bein Adam l'chaveiro are also the very first question Hashem is going to ask you. The Gemara in Shabbos tells us Hashem gives us a 6-question bechina after 120 years. And this is great, because we're given the questions in advance. So we could prepare, we could study, we could, fix it. You're given the test. And the 6 questions, Masechet Shabbos tells us, the first question is, Nasasa v'nasata b'emunah, did you conduct your business affairs with honesty and integrity? The second question is, did you set aside regular times for Torah? I'll mention all 6 just so you'll have them. The third question is, did you try to fulfill pru or vu, to have a family? The fourth is, did you eagerly await, not just believe, did you await with yearning the Mashiach Tzipisa, the Yeshua? Now 5 and 6 are a little more abstract. Pilpalta b'chachma, did you use your mind to try to understand the wisdom of Torah? Right? Chachma of Torah. In other words, kavata itim l'Torah means I learned on a regular basis. But you could learn superficially. Pilpalta b'chachma is more, did you try to understand Torah? And the sixth is, were you a seeker of das, which really is union with Hashem? Did you seek a relationship with Hashem? Right, those are our 6 questions. And obviously one could give a whole shir on all of what all of those elements mean, but I just want to point out that the very first one is, did you conduct your business honestly? Now it's interesting, Emunah has 2 meanings. Emunah can mean honesty and integrity. Emunah can also mean faith in Hashem. And I think Rav Schwab, Zatzal, says that both pshatim come to the same thing. Because if I truly have emunah that Hashem gives me my parnasa, then I know that it's not possible that I'm going to come out ahead when I violate the will of Hashem. Maybe in the short term I will, but eventually it's all going to collapse. In other words, if I think I could gain by cheating and breaking Hashem's law, it's because I don't have emunah that Hashem is giving me my parnasa. So therefore, emunah as honesty and emunah as faith are habahatalya. They are connected to each other. Each one is connected to the other one. Okay. So therefore, keep in mind that the significance of Parshas Mishpatim is that not only did Moshe get it, but we got those mitzvahs before Moshe went up to the mountain. After Moshe was up to the mountain, after Moshe gives us as the Mishpatim, then the Torah at the end of Parsha Mishpatim seems to go backwards, and it describes Moshe building a Mizbeach and assembling the people and reading something called Sefer HaBris, and the people responding Naaseh v'Nishma. And then he goes up to Har Sinai for 40 days. And then we have the Egel and everything else. So there's a huge machlokes rishonim, a very, very important machlokes rishonim. How do you understand the sequence of events at the end of Parshas Mishpatim in connection to the Aseres HaDibros? Rashi learns, and Rashi is based on a Gemara in Masechah Shabbos, that this is an important example of Ein Muktam U'Me'uchar B'Torah. The Torah does not always follow chronological order. Of course, you always have to give a reason why doesn't the Torah follow chronological order, but it doesn't always do it. And therefore, when it says Moshe Rabbeinu built a Mizbeach, and Moshe Rabbeinu sprinkled the people with blood, and the Jewish people said the famous statement, Naaseh v'Nishma, that was before the Aseres HaDibros. In other words, you have to take it back and put it in Parshas Yisro before the Aseres HaDibros. Now, Hakol Maidim, Rashi himself says this, Moshe did not enter the cloud of Har Sinai until after Mishpatim, and then he spent 40 days. That's afterwards. But the Mizbeach, the blood, the reading of Sefer HaBris, which I'll come back to, Naaseh v'Nishma, is before Matan Torah. Ein Muktam U'Me'uchar B'Torah. Ramban does not like the klal. I mean, he can't deny it totally, but the Ramban does not like the klal of Ein Muktam U'Me'uchar B'Torah. And the Ramban has a shita throughout Chumash that you always try to make the events recorded in the Torah in chronological order unless you're absolutely forced to say not. An example is in the beginning of Bamidbar. The beginning of Bamidbar begins Rosh Chodesh Iyar, and then in Baloscha we have the Korban Pesach. So obviously that's not in order. So okay, in such a case, the Ramban concedes that there are times where the Torah is not in chronological order, but if there's no hechrich, no reason that forces you, you don't do it. So the Ramban learns that the building of the Mizbeach, the sprinkling of the blood, is after the Ten Commandments, after the Mishpatim, and then the sprinkling of the blood. Now, based on this machlokas, this will depend what Sefer HaBris is, because it says at the end of Parshas Mishpatim, this is hard to understand. Vayikach es Sefer HaBris. Moshe took a sefer, which would mean a scroll of some type. He took a sefer that is called the Sefer HaBris. He read the Sefer HaBris, and in response to the Sefer HaBris, the Jewish people gave the famous words, Kol asher diber Hashem, naseh v'nishma. Right, the famous words that we, interesting enough, according to the Ramban, those famous words were after Matan Torah. According to Rashi, they were before, like we normally put it. But we want to know, what is the thing that Moshe is reading to Am Yisrael? What is the Sefer HaBris? So Rashi says, the Sefer HaBris is the Torah itself from Bereshis. So it's not commandments. It's the Torah, the story of Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Yetzias Mitzrayim. In other words, Rashi is learning that the Torah was written incrementally over time, and Moshe is reading to them the first installment of the Sefer Torah. The first installment of the Sefer Torah, which is Bereshis and the first part of Shemos. So they're not hearing mitzvos, but they're hearing so much, some mitzvahs, but they're hearing essentially the foundations of Am Yisrael. And Rashi says, Sefer HaBris is from Bereshis until Matan Torah. Ramban learns Sefer HaBris is the Aseres HaDibros and the Mishpatim. You understand why? Because since, according to the Ramban, the Sefer HaBris is after Matan Torah and Mishpatim, that is what Moshe wrote down. Okay? So you see, Rashi couldn't learn that way, because if Rashi is learning the Sefer HaBris is before the Aseres HaDibros, then there's no Aseres HaDibros, right? So the machlokas about Sefer HaBris depends on this machlokas of what is the chronological sequence. By the way, the Ibn Ezra says, an interesting thing, that the Sefer HaBris is the Tochacha at the end of Vayikra. At the end of Vayikra, we have all of these curses. And it says, although they're written later in the Torah, it says, these are the covenant that Moshe gave us at Har Sinai. The Ibn Ezra says he's reading the Tochacha, which actually means, according to the Ibn Ezra, the Tochacha was the very first part of the Torah that was written down, other than the Aseres HaDibros themselves. The Tochacha was the first thing that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote. Okay, so this is not Parsha. Just again, this is nothing fancy. Just to translate the psukim and just to know what it's referring to is not such a Parsha thing. But this is a big machlokas Rashi in the Ramban, and you will see this. In fact, we're going to come across it again about the Mishkan, that Rashi utilizes quite liberally the idea of ein mukta memucher b'Torah, and the Ramban tries to stay away from it. Of course, again, Rashi's big support is a Gemara in Masechah Shabbos. So the Emes says, Rashi is basing it on the Gemara, and again, this highlights an important idea that sometimes comes up. The Rishonim did feel free to offer a pshatim in psukim that are keneged Chazal, as long as it does not impact on halacha l'maisa. So in Pshuto Shel Mikra, the Rishonim were not always bound to the drashos of Chazal. And they were given rishus, or they felt they had rishus to say those explanations. And this is even true with the Ramban. The Ibn Ezra does it like all the time, and the Ramban criticized the Ibn Ezra for it. But even the Ramban doesn't do it that much, but the Ramban does it too. Even though he was so critical of the Ibn Ezra, who does it like almost 100% of the time. Okay, so now though, I want to focus on something. Whether this was after Matan Torah or before Matan Torah, the famous words by which the Jews accepted Hashem's Torah is Naseh v'nishma. Naseh v'nishma. And the Gemara in Shabbos tells us, when the Jewish people said, Na'aseh v'nishma, the Malachei Hashares came and tied 2 crowns of glory on their head. One because of Na'aseh, one because of Nishma. And those crowns of glory remained until the Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf. We lost that crown of glory. Now, what is so great? And in fact, the Gemara emphasizes it's not just that they said Na'aseh v'nishma, the sequence is important. Bisha shehikdimu Na'aseh v'nishma. They said Na'aseh before Nishma. Meaning if they would have said Nishma v'Na'aseh, that wouldn't have been so great. Na'aseh v'nishma is what makes them great. So what is the Maila? So again, there are... the simple idea is, when a person says, Nishma v'Na'aseh, let me hear what you're saying, and then I'll agree to do it, that implies a certain notion of conditionality. Nishma. If I hear and I like it, it makes sense to me, then I'll do it. Na'aseh v'nishma means my commitment to action is absolute. I am giving Hashem a blank check. I am basically saying, whatever you want is what I will do. V'nishma, now I need to hear it. Now I need to learn it. Okay, so the Maila of Na'aseh v'nishma is unconditional acceptance of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's will. I'm not sure if I mentioned it here. The Meforshim say that is the remez of why in Tefillin we put on the hand Tefillin before the head Tefillin. Right? Tefillin Shel Yad is before Tefillin Shel Reish. Tefillin, which is binding your emotions, your life, your strength, your mind to Hashem. You're tying yourself to Hashem's service, is kind of a individualistic Kabbalah Satira every single day. And kishem that at Matan Torah there was a Na'aseh v'nishma. I commit myself to action even before I understand it. Even before I understand it. That's why the Yad has to be before the Reish. That's mechuvan. That corresponds to Na'aseh v'nishma. The Beis Halevi gives a little bit of a different mahalach. He points out that Na'aseh is doing, Nishma is learning. So the question is, how does a Jew view the mitzvah of learning? Is learning a means to know what to do? That's one way. Well, on one level, of course, it is. If I don't learn Hilchos Shabbos, how will I keep Shabbos? If I don't learn Hilchos Kashrus. So learning is a machshir. Learning is an enabler to Maisa. But it's very, very clear that learning is a special, unique, irreplaceable way of connecting yourself to God, even if you don't need it for Lamaisa. That's why even when I learn things that are not Nogea Lamaisa, like Korbanos, I connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's why when we learn Gemara or other things in Ian, I mean, it's not necessarily going to be something I need to know for practical. Or if I have a Rav I can ask every Shaila to, or if I have Rabbi Google, who's the biggest Marbitz Torah in the world, right? So if it's only a matter of I need to learn in order to know, well, Baruch Hashem, I could find other avenues where I don't have to learn and I can get all the answers I want. Elamai, learning is not just a means to an end. It is intrinsically one of the most important way we connect to Hashem. So here's what the Beis Halevi said. If I would have said, Nishma v'naseh, I will learn and I will do, I wouldn't have gotten 2 crowns, because there, all I'm basically saying is, I'm committed to doing and I will learn what I need in order to do. I would have gotten 1 crown. But if I say, I will do, that already includes the necessary learning to be able to do. So what is the v'nishma after the nasa? That even when I know what to do, I will continue to engross myself in the learning of Torah. And that's why, B'shah shehekdimu, when they said Nasa before Nishma, they were Zaycha, the Beis Halevi says, to 2 crowns. Because if they would have said Nishma v'Nasa, they only would have gotten 1 crown. They would have gotten a crown for Maisa. They're agreeing to do something. Memela, the learning will be preliminary to the doing. In fact, the Beis Halevi learns that's the meaning of the Gemara that says that one of the Averos that caused the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash was they didn't recite Birchas HaTorah. They learned Torah, but they didn't recite the blessings over the Torah. I mean, what's so bad about that? Again, there's a lot more to talk about, but the Beis Halevi says because they looked at learning as a means to an end. So you don't make a bracha on a means, just like, you don't make a bracha when you buy matzah. You don't make a bracha, at least like the Bavli, when you build a sukkah. Because that's not the mitzvah, that's a means to a mitzvah. If you look at Torah as only a means to know what to do, so you're not going to make a bracha on it, right? So that's exactly the problem. It was a contradiction to what Nasa v'Nishma represented. All right, so we have 2 pshatim. One is unconditional submission to God, even if I don't. So according to that, it's interesting. According to the first pshat, the Iker Gadlus of Nasa v'Nishma is the word Nasa. The Nasa, even before I know what it is the great thing. According to the Beis Halevi, the Iker Gadlus is the v'Nishma that comes after the v'Nasa, that I'm going to learn even if I know what to do. So it's interesting, on which word do you place the dagesh? It's interesting that this would be a machlokas in these pshatim. But I want to leave you with this final question, and that is, in Parshas Yisrei, which unequivocally is before the Aseres HaDibros, this part is for sure, the Jewish people actually say, Vayanu kol ha'am yachtav. When Moshe gives them messages from Hashem, the people answered in unison, Kol asher diber Hashem nasa. Everything Hashem said, nasa, we're going to do. Now, when you're hearing that pasuk, you almost want to correct the Baal Koreh. Nasa v'nishma. You skipped v'nishma. No, he didn't skip v'nishma. In Parshas Yisrei, the Jewish people said, Kol asher diber Hashem nasa. The words nasa v'nishma only appear at the end of Parshas Mishpatim. Now, whether you learn like Rashi that also occurred before Matan Torah, or you learn like the Ramban that it occurred after Matan Torah, that's fine, that'll be a machlokas. But clearly, the Jewish people had one declaration where they said Nasa, and another declaration that they said Nasa v'Nishma. So, why the difference? Why in Parshas Yisrei does it say only Nasa, and in Parshas Mishpatim it says Nasa v'Nishma? So the Meshech Chochmah gives a beautiful, beautiful answer, and he says the issue is this. Chazal teach us, I think I mentioned the Gemara last week even, that there are 613 mitzvahs in the Torah. But by the way, one should recognize that the statement that everybody knows there are 613 mitzvahs in the Torah, the Ramban actually has a discussion whether that's an article of faith. Are we mechuyev to limit ourselves to that number? Because when you start counting mitzvahs, you actually get many more mitzvahs than the 613. In fact, that's why the Rambam had to develop rules of what you count, what you don't count, when do you aggregate details, when don't you? Because the Rambam said we got to stick with 613, and even if there are 5,000 commandments in the Torah, you got to somehow classify them. The Ramban actually raises the possibility, who says 613 was one particular Amora, Darash Rav Simloi. He's an Amora. Says 613. I mean, are we mechuyev to accept that? Maybe not. Maybe you can have 700, 800, whatever it will be. So the Ramban is mefalpel about this. Again, if somebody would say that today, they would be called an apikoros. But the Ramban was free to debate that issue. He comes out with maskana that even though the number 613 is only mentioned by Rav Simlai, but there are many other midrashim that are presupposing that cheshbon. So he says that's the mainstream view. Okay, Beseder. But when Rav Simlai says 613, he says this is Merumas in the words Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe. Moshe gave us Torah. The word Torah in Gematria is 611, meaning 611 we got from Moshe. Anochi, the first two commandments of the 10 commandments, we heard from Hashem. And I talked last week that implies from the Gemara that Anochi, I am Hashem your God, is a mitzvah. What mitzvah is it? Rambam says the Mitzvah of Emunah, and we discussed last week how could there be a Mitzvah of Emunah. I won't repeat that particular point. But then the Gemara goes on and says we divide the 613 into positive commandments, thou shalt do, and negative commandments, thou shalt not do. And we have a number there too, 248 positives. And that corresponds to the bones of a person. A person has 248 bones. And each positive mitzvah that you do gives a spiritual life. We don't know exactly what that means to a particular bone. I've even seen a sefer, I don't have the sefer, that because Chazal don't give you a checklist, which mitzvah is connected which bone, like, which covers this one. There's actually a sefer that tries to correlate the mitzvahs to the particular bones. And we have 365 negatives keneged the sinews, the ligaments, and the like, in which if I do a lo sasa, I impair the vibrancy of that ligament. Again, I don't know if that translates into arthritis or anything else, but it impairs it on some level. Okay, so now we have a problem. So it turns out that the 613 corresponds to the human body, the spirit, at least the spiritual essence of that human body. Now, there has never been a person in the history of the world who could ever keep the 613 mitzvahs, no matter what. Some mitzvahs are, of course, only apply when there's a Beis HaMikdash. Other mitzvahs don't. Some mitzvahs are only for men and not for women. Some are for women, not for men. Some are for Kaihanim and Leviim and not for other people. Others, like Pidyon HaBen or B'dafka, not for a Kohen or a Levi. So, if you simply said to me, okay, obviously the Eibishter doesn't expect you to do mitzvahs that you're not commanded, that's fine. But the problem is if you're correlating it to my bones, and you're correlating it to my ligaments, and you're going with the number 613, that means that if I'm not doing the Kohen's mitzvah, there's some bone in my body that is not getting what it needs. Hashem set up a system that by definition, every person is a spiritual cripple in some ways. How does that work? How is it shaykh for Hashem to create a Torah in which every single mitzvah is necessary for my vibrancy? Every single one. And yet, it's a system in which it is impossible for me. I mean, today, of course, it's impossible. We don't have a Beis HaMikdash. So that I could say, okay, so we're impaired. That's the nature of Golus. But even when you have a Beis HaMikdash, even when you have everything, nobody can do it. So where's the yashris? Where's the justice? Hashem made it impossible for me to be mashlim, to perfect myself in that spiritual way. So the Meshech Chochmah says that the Svarim, he was not mechadish this idea, give two terutzim. How is it shaykh for me to be mashlim, to perfect my spiritual essence through the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah? One method is Talmud Torah. This is another dimension for the importance of learning Torah. That when I learn Torah, and I learn about the mitzvahs I'm not able to physically keep. Just like Chazal say, when you learn the laws of korbanos, it is as if you brought korbanos. Same thing with every mitzvah. I learn about saras. I don't want to be a leper. I don't want to get saras. Right? Mitzvah of get. Giving a get is actually one of the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. I mean, when a man wants to divorce his wife, he must give a get. Now that must mean, think about this, there must be a get bone in my body. There is a bone that gets its spiritual nourishment from the mitzvah saseh of Gershon. So what does that mean? Come home tonight and say, honey, I love you, but, listen, I got to perfect my neshama, and I need to go through the get mitzvah. What do you want? And by the way, it'll be good. Well, okay, I'm not sure if it's a mitzvah on the woman in that sense, but the man has a mitzvah to give a get. Right? That would be absurd. Right? That would be kind of crazy. So the question is, so how do I get the get bone? Right? How do I get the nourishment of the get? The answer is, I learn Maseches Gittin. I learn Hilchos Gittin. In other words, Talmud Torah can give me the light of the mitzvahs that I'm unable to do. In fact, when the Chafetz Chaim wrote Sfarim, the Chafetz Chaim wrote many Sfarim on Kachim. People don't realize outside of the yeshiva world. We know the Chafetz Chaim, Mishnah Brura, Lashon Hara, Sefer Chafetz Chaim, Shmiras HaLashon. But he mamish brought back, in fact, the learning of Kachim in Brisk, all of these places. Kachim is now the highest status symbol in the yeshiva world, Kachim. But Kachim was neglected by most of people who were learning for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the Chafetz Chaim was one of the main people who brought back the learning of Kachim. He republished at his own expense old Svarim on Kachim. They've been out of print for years. He wrote himself Chidushim on Kachim. He compiled the equivalent of a riff. There's no riff on Kachim, but he himself gave you the synopsis of the Sugyas, plus the equivalent of a Rashi and a Tosfos. I mean, he did a lot of work on Kachim. And people criticized him. They said to him, why are you spending so much time on Kachim? It's not Nogea L'Maisa. It's not practical, as if the Chafetz Chaim didn't occupy himself with practical things. He says, it's not Nogea L'Maisa. So the Chafetz Chaim gave two answers. One answer is, if you believe in the coming of Mashiach, then it is Nogea L'Maisa. The Beis HaMikdash can come back tomorrow. You need to know halachos, karbanos. So when you learn Kachim, you are affirming that you have Emunah in Mashiach. That's one answer. The second answer he gave was that it's precisely those chalakim of Torah that we're not able to do, that we must learn b'dafka, because that's the only way our neshama gets the light of those mitzvahs. So l'maisa, there's a special inyan to learn things that are not nogea l'maisa, because they give our neshama that kesher. So that's answer number one. Answer number two is Avas Yisrael. Now you may say, what does Avas Yisrael have to do with the 613 mitzvahs? I mean, Avas Yisrael is a great thing, but how does that give me the 613 mitzvahs? So let's imagine this. A man puts tefillin on his arm. He doesn't think, my arm has done a mitzvah of tefillin. Rather, the arm is part of me. So what is done to my arm, or is done with my arm, is what I do, because this is me. So how does a Jew regard themselves? If I regard myself as a distinct individual, a discrete person, so me is me, so me as me cannot do 613 mitzvahs, no matter how big a tzaddik I am. There are going to be mitzvahs I'm not able to do. But if I have Avas Yisrael and I connect myself to Am Yisrael, I become like a limb on a body, or I become like a cell in a body. And Am Yisrael is a transcendental entity with a past, present, future. Just like the human body. Every cell in your body can change. Right? Every cell, except maybe the brain cells, but virtually every cell in your body now was not there 20 years ago, because cells die, right? So are you the same person? In other words, there's a whole philosophical question about continuity of identity. Why am I the same person if every cell in my body is different? Okay, you can think about those conundrums. But the basic idea is that I'm part of this body. So this body keeps on going, right? So Klal Yisrael is the same thing. If you regard yourself as a cell on this organism, you're connected to the organism of Am Yisrael. So it turns out the mitzvahs that were done 1,000 years ago are still the mitzvahs that I've done. The mitzvahs of the men are the mitzvahs of the women. The mitzvahs of the Kohen is the mitzvah of the Yisrael. The mitzvahs of the past are the mitzvahs of the present. Because the same way, if I put on tefillin, yesterday, and my cells are different today, I still put on tefillin. Because I put on tefillin, right? So Memela, Achdus and Avas Yisrael is a change in your self-perception, in which you don't perceive yourself as a discrete individual, but you're mevatel yourself to the klal. So that's the other way. So it turns out we have two answers to how can I perfect my soul with the 613 mitzvahs. Do I do it through Talmud Torah or Avas Yisrael? So the Meshech Chachma says, this is marumas beautifully in the way the Torah phrases the responses of the Jewish people. In Yisrael, Vayanu kol ha'am yachtav, underline yachtav. So the first pasuk is talking about when the Jewish people live in unity, yachtav, togetherness, achdus. They can say to God, everything you command us, we can do. I can't do it, you can't do it, he can't do it, she can't do it. But as a yachtav, we could be makayim the Torah in maisa, in action. But the pasuk in Mishpatim says, Vayanu kol ha'am. In other words, it omits the word yachtav. The Torah is merames. What happens when there is a time when the Jewish people are not unified? When there's sinas chinam, when there's polarization, when there's dissension, when I'm not connecting myself to the klal. In such a situation, I cannot say to God, I can do the Torah. So I come with plan B, nasa, I do it, v'nishma, through learning. Nishma means to learn and understand. So therefore, the pasuk in Yisro is the Avas Yisrael route, and that's why it says Yachtav and Nasa. And the pasuk in Mishpatim is the Talmud Torah route, that even when there's no Yachtav, there is the ability of Hashlama, of perfection, through Nasa v'Nishma Talmud Torah. So I'll just end, but Pashtus, these are two different paths. There's the path of unity, there's the path of learning when there's no unity. But in reality, these are two shvilin, these are two roads that ultimately converge and become one. Because the Gemara tells us, we say this every day in Eretz Yisrael, Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom B'Aylam, that those who learn Torah should increase peace in the world. That Torah itself is a vehicle that should bring Avas Yisrael. If, Litzarenu, we sometimes see that that is not the case, well, that's a real good question. You got to ask, why isn't that the case exactly, huh? Give a teretz, I don't know. Meaning, is there something wrong in the Talmud Torah that doesn't bring shalom? I don't know. I'm not going to say one way or the other, but we all know, Chazal say, Talmidei Chachamim bring shalom into the world. So from Talmud Torah, we should eventually come to the pathway of Abbas Yisrael. So B'Yezras Hashem, may we be Zaycha to follow both of these paths, the path of Talmud Torah, the path of Abbas Yisrael, and in that way be Makarev, the Geula.
Yibane, Yibane, Hamikdash, Yitzion,